Rachel Reeves's tears at PMQs, the resignation of the Deputy Prime Minister, huge losses in the local elections and constant speculation about Keir Starmer's future as leader. 2025 has been an annus horribilis for the Labour Party. On the up has been Nigel Farage and Reform UK, winning control of councils, parliamentary by-elections and attracting a slew of Tory defectors. The right-wing populist party has maintained a healthy lead in the polls for the last 12 months. 16-year-olds have been given the right to vote, and many of them will see the new Green Party leader Zack Polanski as their champion, whilst the Liberal Democrats and Ed Davey have continued to progress, winning more council seats this year than any other party. Recent months have seen a more polished and professional Kemi Badenoch give the official opposition a boost. However, the Tories are still languishing in the polls and know there is a long way to go before they can claim to be a genuine alternative government. On the international stage, Donald Trump began his second presidential term after a 4-year interlude, and it's been a wild ride that most anticipated. Tariffs, the Epstein files, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the election of the first Muslim governor in the US, the drive-by on Zelensky by J.D. Vance in the Oval Office, and splits in the MAGA movement that have seen Trump fall out with Elon Musk and Marjorie Taylor Greene are only the edited highlights and lowlights of the Orange One's first 12 months in office. Elsewhere in geopolitics, the Middle East still simmers, the Ukraine war continues to rage, and despite victories for progressives in Germany and Canada, the feeling remains that liberal democracy is in retreat as right-wing populists continue to gain momentum. I'm Frank McKenna, and this Downtown Den Politics podcast is going to try and make sense of what has been a turbulent year in the world of politics.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Okay, so much to get through, as you can tell from my introduction, guys. I, as ever, am joined by Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. Joe, fresh from a wonderful night out at Chelmsford with Nigel Farage and his gang of fans. Apparently you were booed and hissed, Joe.
Yeah, if that's the warm welcome from Chelmsford, I won't be going back. There are about 1,000 people in a tent on a very wet and windy evening at Chelmsford Racecourse, but they love Nigel. They don't particularly like me.
Well, we won't boo and we won't hiss. Although, when we get to next week's programme and we look at your predictions from last year, you may get a raspberry. However, let's turn our attention to what has been a active, turbulent, I would say fairly depressing year for politics, 2025, I have to say. And Jim, let's start with the government's trials and tribulations, of which there have been many. And I would suggest, James, much of their own making.
Yes, it's been extraordinary, really. I mean, it actually started almost immediately they came into office in 24. My sort of overall feeling is that there's been a sort of plateau of performance, the inability to get the economy really going. I mean, the underlying problem is the inability to get the economy going. And because of that, all these sort of rumours and things like that start. But you're quite right. Also added to that is self-inflicted wounds, losing Angela Rayner and that becoming a soap opera, and the manoeuvrings of other people. So here we have the incredible spectacle of a government with a huge majority that ought to be getting on with some of the major issues and some of the most difficult issues, like we've already often discussed on this podcast: social care, the environment, things like that, which need bold decisions for the long term. There seems to be a reluctance to take those decisions. And then this is, of course, particularly focused on the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, because a lot of it is down to her, whether this government succeeds or not. And, she seems to be, she would deny this, but in a war with business and with particular interests like the farmers. And so the overall pattern of the year hasn't changed that much. The occasional scandal, the continuing inability to get the economy going, the complete inability to deal with the boat people, even coming over in December now, and this feeling of dissatisfaction. I mean, we'll come on to the other parties later, but the government must be hoping for some turn up in the economy. That if growth begins to happen, it begins to put the other parties on the back foot. But there's no particular sign of that at the moment. And whilst that continues, we'll see continued speculation about Sir Keir Starmer and the huge hurdle he's got to face coming into the May elections, which are now, of course, shrouded in controversy because of the decision, almost as Parliament was rising, to suggest that councils might want to put off the elections. And whilst there might be good reasons for that, as some people say, this is like third world politics. You try and stop elections to deny people a vote so that they could say, well, it wasn't a big major election in England and Sir Keir didn't do well. And you can see what the accusation is going forward. So not been a great year for the government, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about those local election postponements in a future episode, I think, because I probably disagree with your assessment there, James, and would simply say, as I said to Joe last week, most people out in the country don't give a shit about that, to be honest. In fact, given the fact that probably only 20% of them participate, then I'd suggest that few of them are going to be complaining about the fact the government is saving literally hundreds of millions of pounds on elections that will be relevant for only 12 months. But as I say, we'll get into the detail of that at a later stage. Joe, your assessment of Labour, and I think James give a reasonably good assessment there in terms of where the government has failed to make an impact, and it is on the economy, stupid. But he's also referenced, and I think rightly, that they've managed to fall out with an awful lot of pressure groups and interest groups, and that is never a good thing for a government. Choose your enemies and pick your friends as well, and they don't appear to have picked many friends. And one other thing, just to get your comment on, Joe, I read an article, I think, on a blog that was produced for the New Statesman this week, saying Labour's 5 families. So we all remember the giggle we had when the Conservatives had, was it 7 families the Tories ended up with? But I think it's right, isn't it? You do seem to have this parliamentary Labour Party that has itself a number of interest groups, rather than being a coherent PLP that gets behind its government and starts to take those difficult and challenging decisions that surely they knew they would have to take when they were elected back in 2024.
No, absolutely. And I think, part of the problem with that is if you haven't got a coherent message coming from the very top, then you are inevitably either going to be looking to protect your own position, whether that's hanging on to your majority for the next time round, or whether you are going to do as some of the MPs who have now got rural areas have discovered, actually they get better support, if you like, by supporting the farmers and going against the government. I mean, I wouldn't disagree with a word that Jim said in analysis of the government's performance, and I think it's been terribly, terribly disappointing. And I know we're going to talk about international matters a bit later, but I still believe that Keir Starmer has done really, really well internationally. And I do see a glimmer of hope in, the movement back towards Europe, whether it's through Erasmus, whether it's the coalition of the willing, whether it's his obvious much warmer relationship with European leaders. But I do think they've got a real problem. And the problem is that from all of the people that they've managed to piss off so comprehensively, whether they're farmers, pensioners, business groups, carers, whoever it is, the refrain is the same: they don't listen. And that, I think, is a real problem, because if the government is perceived as not listening, then people will stop talking to them and they'll talk to somebody else, and that's a huge problem. And so the resignation of Angela Rayner, which forced a mini reshuffle, which saw Shabana Mahmood as Home Secretary, has proved to be quite quite good, in my opinion. I mean, she's to the right of a lot of people in the Labour Party, but she does feel like she's getting a grip. She does feel like she's got an energy that Yvette Cooper hadn't got. Yvette Cooper as Foreign Secretary, I think most people would have thought, what a bizarre appointment. And as far as I can tell, she's made no impact whatsoever. But the worst appointment was David Lammy to become Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary. I mean, his performance when he stood in for Starmer at PMQs was just memorably awful, excruciating. And of course, we've then had the election because of Angela's resignation for the deputy leader of the party, which was won by Lucy Powell. So, I don't think Keir Starmer will be sitting pretty or sitting comfortably, but he's got to get something better on the communications front and be seen to be listening and actually hearing what people are saying. I mean, they're coming out with bizarre things like banning trail hunting. That is not the top of people's agenda. The top of people's agenda is the cost of living. And probably second to that is immigration. And, they're tackling neither of those things, and they're tinkering around the edges, and they look like a government that has been in power for 15 years, not one that's been in power for less than 2 years. They look tired, out of ideas, out of energy.
And it all seemed to start to unravel from March, really, when I've looked back on the year. If you took Q1, quarter one, then Starmer had actually done well in terms of his relationship with Trump, getting off to a flying start, and surprised people, I think, in terms of the way he was able to handle the new president in the White House. Many people thought that was going to be a bit of a car crash. He went over to America and did a good job in terms of getting close to the States. Now, we could start to scrutinise some of those so-called deals that have been announced over the 12 months, and I don't think they do bear much scrutiny. Nevertheless, in the first quarter of 2025, Keir Starmer was getting an awful lot of credit for the way in which he'd handled Trump. Then you move into this vote for the welfare cuts, where Labour tried to, or the government tried to take a smidgen, £5 billion, off a multi-100 billion pound budget, and Labour MPs rebelled. And this is the problem, I think, Jim, that the government has. I agree with Joe that the messaging from the top hasn't been great. There doesn't appear to be a clear strategy. Nonetheless, with a majority of, 300 or something, I mean, it's 100 or so, isn't it, majority? 400 MPs. And you go into a vote on, as I say, a very limited cut on a welfare budget that needs to be tackled, and you can't rely on your parliamentary Labour Party to get behind that. And that, I'm afraid, is where the wheels really fell off, because that then led to 9 months almost of speculation as to what taxes Rachel Reeves was going to have to make in a budget, which she then compounded the mistake by, or the difficulty, sorry, by mistakenly calling that budget for very late in November. So for me, I agree with what you both said in terms of lack of direction, lack of cohesion, but I do think it all comes back to, when you look at and assess those 12 months of politics, that decision by Labour MPs to rebel against the welfare cuts really did, I think, disentangled the government's whole programme.
Yeah, well, I mean, the actual scenario that played out was that right at the beginning, we had that decision on winter fuel payments, which in a sense sort of started all that unrest about welfare reform. Then the welfare tale that you've told, bits and pieces, incoherence. I just paint an alternative picture. If they prepared more for government, gosh, the parallels with the England cricket team are here. Under preparation, if they'd come into office and dealt with the two major issues of welfare reform and social care, and in many ways they're interlinked, but with a big majority, a big vision. And to say to Labour backbenchers, I mean, we all understand that Labour backbenchers in their hearts, want to support people who are in trouble in the welfare system. But we know that it's beyond that. And we know that there are people who are gaming the system, particularly since COVID. If they presented a total picture of welfare reform and social care reform, and really sold it to the backbenchers, then the outcome could have been completely different. But I mean, Wes Streeting, I regret to, well, no, I don't regret to say he's entitled to do it. He can put his finger on the button. I think this analogy that we seem to be like the maintenance man is quite clever in a way. I mean, setting aside what it might be doing for his personal ambitions, but he's got a point in the sense that it's just tinkering. Oh, I've got a leak in this pipe. Oh, we'll come around and fix it. Got to fix it here, fix it there. And what you actually want is someone who's going to build almost a new house, and certainly in terms of social care and welfare, and that's really been the problem.
Yeah, Joe. Final word on the government from you in terms of its last 12 months' performance. We'll look ahead to what the next 12 months may hold for Labour and the other political parties in next week's episode. But last 12 months, marks out of 10.
Well, I was going to say 3. I will grudgingly say 4. And I think one of the most damning things, given that it is a Labour government with a walloping majority after 14 years of Tory mismanagement, chaos and destruction of public services, the man who's in charge of the social mobility inquiry says the Prime Minister and the government have got no coherent strategy for social mobility. If a Labour government hasn't got that, then what on earth are they for?
Yeah, I think that's a generous 4. Joe, Jim, didn't take your out of 10 mark for Labour and the government.
5. I'm giving 5 because I to try and balance this a little bit, because we're sort of generally agreed. There are some long-term initiatives in the green agenda, housing, hopefully, is going to come through, nuclear power, things to the future, which we may look back in retrospect and say, yes, some foundations in some areas of public policy were put in place. I mean, I think we have to be fair and acknowledge that. The trouble is, on the big issues, there's been failure so far. So 5 out of 10 for me.
I'm afraid I'll have to go 3 out of 10, simply because I think as far as the business community are concerned, Labour has shot its bolt already. We're only 18 months into the government. National insurance increases, huge hikes in national minimum wage, which certainly won't help young people into the employment market. A spike in unemployment, 5.1% now, the unemployment rate in the UK, and to add to the dilemmas that business are going to face, particularly SMEs. And I think this is where Labour has, as Joe said earlier, stopped listening. The employment law bill that has just gone through, or is likely to go through, it is an absolute car crash as far as many small businesses are concerned, and again will impact on people's hiring. And so it's going to have the exact opposite effect of what Labour said it was coming into power for, which was to grow the economy. So low marks from me, I'm afraid. And just one positive note for the government as we go into Christmas and the new year: inflation fell and interest rates were cut, and that, we are told, is going to continue into the new year. So there may be some green shoots of recovery, but of course we are not talking about what may happen in the future today. We are talking about their performance over the past 12 months, and hence my 3 out of 10 mark. So there you go. Not a particularly happy time for the government. Let's briefly talk about the parties that are also considered to be progressive. It's the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, who I think, in their own ways, have both had successful years. Obviously, the Greens have improved their profile significantly since the election of Zack Polanski, and ditching this nonsensical idea of having 2 political leaders, one which has now been adopted by Jeremy Corbyn's party, your party, but there you go. So the Green Party, let's turn our attention to them first. And Joe, Polanski's made a good fist of his start as leader there, hasn't he?
Yes, he has, and he's obviously, attracted an awful lot of interest, particularly among younger people, and interestingly, particularly amongst women. And I think while Jeremy Corbyn is ripping himself apart, a man who can have a fight in an empty house, the people who perhaps would have naturally migrated to that very sort of left of Labour are finding Zelensky quite attractive. I mean, I think, interestingly, a lot of people think he's completely bonkers, and his policies are very, very sort of, well, they're not even part baked. They're not actually, the ingredients haven't come out of the store cupboard yet. But I do think we might be looking at he's got he's a good communicator. So you've got him versus Nigel Reform, if you like. They're both populists with very, very unvarnished, unthought through policies, but they're appealing to quite a large chunk of the electorate.
And Jim, Green Party, for you, good year for them?
Well, it's undoubtedly been a good year. I mean, this guy's getting sort of more publicity than Carla Denyer and people like that in the past, for the reasons that he's prominent, he's a good communicator, and he's inspiring young people, and he is emphasising, as I've said before, very much economic issues, social issues, a sort of Corbyn ground, if you like. That's one of the problems that Corbyn's got, that Zelensky's sort of addressing, the radical solutions that those sort of people on that wing of politics think need to happen. And of course, at some point, as with the Reform Party, we are going to submit these parties to economic scrutiny. What would they actually do in office? And I think for various reasons, both of them will have difficulties in explaining to people what their economic strategy is and what the implications are. Because if people don't like the current tax system and it's too burdensome, I fancy that it won't be under Corbyn, but under Polanski, having anything to do with government, it would be disastrous for business. I've not seen the sort of reaction from the people who are in the Green Party who want to particularly prioritise the environment, because that's, if we're looking at 2025, the green agenda, net zero and all those sort of things for climate change, despite burning fires in California and in the Mediterranean and huge storms and hurricanes, the world seems, under the direction of of Donald Trump, to be sort of turning its back on what actually needs to be done on that front. So it'll be interesting if Zelensky does turn into his more traditional areas, but it has been a good year for him, and people are in despair. People have lost faith in the two main parties, and they're looking for something else, and he's benefiting from that.
They're looking for alternatives. I mean, what Zack Polanski would say, rightly or wrongly, is that the clue is in the name, the Green Party, and so they do not need to burnish their credentials as far as that particular agenda is concerned. Where they've often lacked credibility is on the economy, and what he's trying to outline is a credible alternative economic strategy. Now, like you, Jim, I don't think it is particularly credible. Nevertheless, at this moment in time, when people are totally cheesed off with the mainstream parties, looking for an alternative, many young people not going anywhere near Reform or the Conservatives will see Zack Polanski as an attractive proposition, and that, of course, is evidenced in the polls. So we will see how they go on over the next 12 months. Perhaps the other thing that Polanski has spotted is that actually the only area of policy where the government appears to have a semblance of knowledge as to what it's doing and have a strategy is on the green agenda, because Ed Miliband, at least, has got to grips with that department and is trying his best to ensure that the objectives that the government set itself in its manifesto are being met. Whether or not he can keep that particular train on the track next year, we wait to see. But again, there's less space, I would suggest, in that area for the opposition to go after, unless you are to the right and you think the green agenda, as Donald Trump thinks, is all a bit of a hoax. So Polanski, I think, maybe has made a pragmatic and sensible choice there and has got a decent case to make in terms of staying away from those issues that we would all, I think, associate with the Green Party anyway. Let's turn our attentions to the Liberal Democrats then. And as I say, they were more council seats this year than any other political party. They, of course, did extremely well in the 2024 general election, going to north of 70 MPs. Their success has not necessarily been referenced by the number of appearances on the airwaves, whether that be on the BBC, Sky, or anywhere else for that matter. Nonetheless, Ed Davey continues to quietly get on with the job, and he's doing an okay. He's making an okay fist of it, I think, Jim.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, while the polls go absolutely, rocketing up for reform and booming down for Keir Starmer and everything, the Liberal Democrats have stayed steady. And actually, they are continuing to take seats in council by-elections from all parties. I mean, they've lost a few as well. But having that 70 MPs means they've got a bigger presence in the Commons. It means they've got people on select committees. It means that they've got people who can go back to constituencies. They're no longer a party of the Southwest and the fringes of London. They're right across the country. And I think Ed Davey, when he does speak, he's been absolutely really disciplined, actually, in sticking to the things that they have said. We're making this all right. The Liberal Democrats don't need to talk about Europe because everybody knows where they stand. So, if you think it's a betrayal of the referendum, well, don't vote Liberal Democrat. But he's been consistent. He's been consistent on social care, which neither the government nor the Tory party have even mentioned. And he's been consistent on pollution in water, whether it's seas or rivers. And I think they are doing well. They've got some good performers. Daisy Cooper, deputy leader, is very good when she stands in for Ed Davey. I think people have got to know Ed Davey and his personal life and, the trials and tribulations that he has had or has with his very, very disabled son. But he comes across as a human being, with a real life, a real backstory. He doesn't have to keep saying my father was a toolmaker. But he actually is there, and he might not be the most exciting thing, but there's an awful lot to be said for steady competence, which I think is what they're doing in local government. And it is interesting. And I mean, we've talked about this before, about the ridiculous coverage that Reform get in comparison. But I have noticed of late that the Lib Dems are getting more coverage, particularly on the BBC. And I wonder whether, they have finally stopped thinking that they're the only people in the country that are doing PR, because their argument was always that Reform got a bigger share of the vote. That is not how you do broadcasting or balance. So they are getting better coverage. And I think, they've now got people who are quite experienced, whether they've been in local councils and have now come to Westminster, or they've been in Westminster for a few years. And they're doing good stuff. They've got a new leader in the Lords, Jeremy Purvis. They're very, very good on foreign affairs. And I just think, actually, just keep going steady as she goes. You don't necessarily have to be up and down in the polls. What you don't want to do is to go down, but being steady is not bad in these febrile times.
Well, I think it fits with their strategy, doesn't it? They know where their voters are. They know who they're wanting to target. I think where Davey's been good this year is that less stunts. Well, he did a couple of them during the local election campaign, but much less of that. And more serious in terms of addressing those big issues, as you say, Joe, Europe, which increasingly, his views are chiming with those of the British people. Poll after poll now showing people's dissatisfaction with Brexit. And that will only increase, I think, as the economy continues to bump along. And then the other area where, of course, he can be bolder than the Prime Minister is on the United States, and he's been able to call out Donald Trump's idiosyncrasies in a more fervent way than the Prime Minister or others have been able to do. So I think it's been a good year for Ed Davey, a good year for the Liberal Democrats, Jim. And that may, of course, be important when we get to the next general election, because the other thing he's been careful not to do is be overly critical of the government. He's not tried to kick Starmer too often when he's down. Okay, he's been constructively critical, if I can put it that way, but you can see the possibility, the potential, come the next election, if reform continues its momentum, where the Liberal Democrats are placing themselves as the honest broker here, the safe place to go, who could keep a check on Labour and actually perhaps make Labour a bit more radical on those issues such as social care and Europe.
You've almost talked me out of what I was going to say, because everything you say is true. You know, it starts on Trump, social care, pollution, very courageous, and Europe in particular, because we're seeing increasing evidence that Labour is moving a little bit faster than I thought, actually, towards a more sensible arrangement with Europe, and to some extent that is down to Ed Davey. But what I was going to say was to sort of break the consensus, this Christmas consensus around what we're saying today, is that I wonder whether, because I think the clue to my criticism is Joe's word of steady. I mean, the fact is they are fourth in the polls, about 10-12%. I mean, Joe can talk about by-election wins in local councils and things like that, but when people are asked, who do you want to form the next government, the Liberal Democrats are still bumping along in fourth place. And I was going to say that thank you very much indeed, Sir Ed. You've done a tremendous job, but you don't quite have the charisma for the next general election. And we need to have Callum Miller, who's their foreign affairs spokesman. The more I hear him, the more I'm impressed as the leader of the Liberal Democrats. But that's very unkind to Ed Davey, and I'm sure you'll dismiss it. But I just don't see them making that surge. And in terms of the geography, yeah, they're very strong in the south and southwest now, but they've not regained the Midlands and the north of England. The seats that they used to have in Bradford and Southport and places like that. They haven't expanded out there. Now maybe that's the challenge. That people like Mike Story did in Liverpool to make the Liberal Democrats and Mark Hunter in Stockport make the Liberal Democrats credible in the north of England as well. And I just don't see Sir Ed making that breakthrough, but I'm sure I'm being very unkind.
Steady Eddie, as they may refer to him in the corridors of power. I'm not sure whether they do, by the way. I'm just making that statement. Right, marks out of 10 then for the Liberal Democrats first. I would say 7. I think they've had a good year. I think you're right, Jim. They need to try and penetrate elsewhere in the country now. But if you look at the strategy that won them so many seats at the general election, then 12% of the vote's okay. As long as you can get those votes in particular constituencies that you were targeting, then in a first past the post system, which of course the Liberal Democrats have been long-time critics of, so they are simply trying to play the game that has been the hand that has been dealt to them. And yeah, as I say, I think that they've done pretty well. Joe, marks out of 10 for Ed Davey and his team.
Well, I'm slightly biased, obviously. So I'm going to go for 8, although I think realistically it's 7. And I would just say, just to push back slightly on what Jim said, I mean, I agree completely about Callum Miller. And I think, by the time we get to the next election or the one after, he may well be the leader of the Liberal Democrats, not because there's any, desire to get rid of Ed, but Ed might decide, I actually want to step back. But I do think, we are still 3 years away from an election. The Liberal Democrats can still just carry on being steady, and it may well be that an unspoken agreement with Labour to keep the reform out, or even with Greens to keep reform out, might work in their favour and would disperse the votes more across the country, as Jim was saying.
James, marks out of 10.
Yeah, I'm going for 8 as well, because above everything else and any sort of reservations I have about Ed, their stance on Europe really deserves credit, because we've been talking around Labour's inability to get the economy going, and the three of us know that the closer relationship with Europe is common sense and would evidently boost our growth. So 8.
8 out of 10. Well, there you go. So the Liberal Democrats, they may be fourth in the polls, but the leading as far as the Downtown Den Politics podcast goes at this moment in time. I didn't ask you for your marks about the Green Party. I do apologise. I'd give the Greens 6. I think they've improved in terms of where they were, but I still think there's a long way to go. So 6 out of 10 for me. Jim?
I would probably agree on 6. I've seen them operating in local government in the Bristol area, and some of the problems that they get into there when they're actually governing a city are not great. We haven't got time to go into them today, but there are question marks about how they actually operate at a local level when they've got power.
Joe?
Yeah, I would agree with that. You can't do it all on one person, so I would give them 5. But they've boosted their coverage and their profile, so 5 for that.
Marvellous. Thank you, Joe. Right, we are going to take a short break before we come back and assess how the last 12 months have gone for the Conservative Party and reform. If you are watching on YouTube, as I know many of you do, I apologise for Jim Hancock freezing from time to time, although his voice is coming through loud and clear. So we're going to take a short break and we'll try and sort out that small technical difficulty that James seems to be having. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
Hi, I'm Stephen Hesketh, CEO of Savvy Hotels, owner of the Hospitality Hero and co-owner of DivaFest. And I'm here today to share with you our great event that's coming up in collaboration with Downtown and Business, which is the Great Art of Hospitality Conference, happening on the 26th of February in Manchester City Centre at the Treehouse Hotel. This event will bring the creme de la creme of hospitality all in one room. We're looking at 200 individuals coming together to listen to the great operators in hospitality, but likewise some political big hitters to also question them on all things hospitality. We can't wait to see you there. Tickets will be on sale very, very soon via the website, and look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics podcast. This week we are reviewing 2025. We've done Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party and their performance over the last 12 months. We now turn our attention to the Conservatives and reform. And let's start with the Tories and Kemi Badenoch. So again, reflecting on our programme from about 12 months ago, she was seen as toast. We all assumed that she would be facing a leadership challenge by the time she got to September, October time. Robert Jenrick was on manoeuvres and she seemed to be struggling badly in her role as leader of the opposition. Fair to say, I think, that since her conference speech in Manchester in October, she has turned things around, at least internally, and those rumours of a leadership challenge have somewhat disappeared. Nevertheless, the polls are being stubborn and are not shifting. She has lost several people to reform, defections, although I doubt whether she's been sorry to see the back of most of them. Danny Kruger may be the exception to that particular rule. And the Prime Minister's questions, she has certainly improved her performance and has embarrassed the Prime Minister on more than one occasion. She was able to claim credit for seeing the back of Peter Mandelson. She did have a little bit of a go at Angela Rayner, but from memory, I think she blew that particular PMQs. But subsequently, she's done well on the economy. Her attack after the Chancellor's speech at the budget, I think, was effective. And she's coined this phrase, benefit street, which I think will be a big issue as we move forward into 2026. So, James, the Conservative Party, how do you feel they have performed over the last year?
I think they're in a weak position. I mean, whatever we say about Badenoch, and you more or less summed it up, she has improved her position, but the great party of government is a much diminished organisation now, and is suffering from this almost unique problem that both what we call the main parties are almost equally unpopular, and that's almost unprecedented. So they've not made the sort of recovery from the general election that normally we're sort of beginning to move into the middle period of the parliament, and they should be doing far better. So anything we say in mitigation has to say that this great party is in deep trouble, the sort of trouble they were in post 1997 under the first edition of William Hague. And also, of course, they've got this, as you say, this leakage to the right. But I think she's done two things. She has focused on the economy with this Benefit Street argument, and she's slightly toned down the immigration issue, because I think we've agreed before the Conservatives cannot beat reform on immigration. And if they chase them down that rabbit hole, they will alienate the sort of centre ground people that might be tempted to go off to the Liberal Democrats. The Prime Minister's question is saying, yes, she's improved that considerably. I just a cautionary one. I wouldn't overdo it. Her budget reply was laced with good gags and so on, but you can begin to overdo that and be too clever by half. She needs to keep drilling down, focusing on the substance of the matter, which is that Keir Starmer can't match her for clever one-liners. He's not that sort of person, but his economic record is what she needs to bear down on. So yes, a better year for her. And I think what happened was, Jenrick was put back in his box. I think Badenoch and her aides will have had a word with him. And also, I just think that after all the changes that have been in the leadership of the Conservative Party over the last 10 years, about 7 or 8 leaders, they just really thought that actually changing the leader would make them look ridiculous and perhaps wouldn't improve things at all. So a better year for Kemi Badenoch, but a long way to go.
Yeah, there is a long way to go, but I do think she has significantly improved, and credit to her for that. She has been aided and abetted by Robert Jenrick, though, because he's made a couple of real bad faux pas. The comment he made about, what was he didn't see a white face in Birmingham for the 9 hours he was there, or something stupid like that. It wasn't that bad, but it was a daft comment to make. And then I think he just started to look very Alan Partridge with some of those video clips he was doing. He really did. He looked like a dickhead. And I think a lot of the Tories have thought, actually, he ain't the man for us. So she's improved on a personal level, but I think, as I say, aided and abetted. And Jim's mate, Mel Stride, I think has proved to be a credible shadow chancellor. And then people like James Cleverly have started to find their voice as well. And
as has Tom Cleverly with our 5-1 win at Doncaster at the weekend.
Sorry. You see the way I opened the door for you there, Jim. So I think, Joe, I know you've probably been Kemi Badenoch's biggest critic, but I think you would have to concede that she's improved somewhat over the last quarter or so.
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, in the last month, I would say she has improved. She has got more confidence in her own skin, if you like. She's never going to come across as a warm, empathetic human being that you'd like to have a cup of tea or a pint with. And as far as charisma goes, I think she's sadly lacking. But she has got a new confidence. I think, she wouldn't have done so well or improved so much had Labour not been so disastrous. She has benefited from a pretty diabolical, disaffected, fed up Labour Party. I think, interestingly, the defections, well, they're not really defections because they're just ordinary people, but reform is now rapidly looking like a Conservative tribute band, which in a way is a really good thing for Kemi Badenoch, because it makes it look like, actually, this is the real Conservative Party. So you've got people like Mel Stride, he's a serious player. James Cleverly, good bloke. You've got people like Katie Lamb, new intake, but she's speaking well, she's a good communicator. So actually, I think the Conservatives have got some hope. I think where she could be very canny and very sensible, and we might come on to this when we talk about the sort of more international aspect of the past year and looking ahead, there will be a time when she needs to be seen to be working with the government for the national interest. And I think that's where the Conservatives can draw on their historical strength, that they will put country before party. And I think that might be a challenge that she has yet to rise to, because if you remember, she failed to turn up to some quite important briefings on matters of national security and things like that. So she needs to raise her game a bit. and she needs to move away, as you say, Frank, from trying to do the sort of the one-line attacks on Starmer, and now begin to look like a party that is a party of great statesmen and women. So, you know, I think they've got everything to play for.
Okay. Same question then. Marks out of 10 for the Conservatives. Start with you this time, Jim.
I would say 7, 6. Let's not go mad. You know, it's come from a terrible year in 2024 to a small recovery. So I'll give her 6.
Okay, I will go 6.5. There you go. I'll split the difference because I think that she has at least provided them with a route map back to credibility and potentially power, depending on how Reform perform next year. So, Joe, 6.5 from me, 6 from James.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm with Jim. 6.
6 from you as well. Okay, so on to Reform then, and Joe's mate Nigel. So we can say this through gritted teeth, but it's been a good year for Reform. They've continued to make the political weather, particularly, I think, in the early part of the year. They really did manage to dominate the headlines over the issue of immigration, of course. That was the big one. But I do sense, and you may check me as far as this is concerned, but I sense that over the past month or so, Nigel has not been having a particularly happy time of it. He was very tetchy at that press conference he did with the allegations over anti-Semitism and racism when he was at Dulwich College, and that story hasn't gone away. It keeps re-emerging as more people come forward and demand apologies. He just doesn't seem his usual jovial self, Joe. Now, he may have been in good form in Chelmsford, surrounded by his fanboys and fangirls, but up against an increasingly scrutinising media, he appears to be a little ruffled, if I can put it that way.
Yes, and I think it's that old thing, reality bites. I think, you know, the whole thing about Dulwich College, what we saw was his thin skin, and it's very interesting that so often, you know, he is compared to Trump, but we also know Trump is all bluster and very thin-skinned. I think there are a couple of things. I don't think the Dulwich College is the biggest problem, and I think it's a mistake for the media to go down that rabbit hole. They actually need to be concentrating on what's going on now. I think Nathan Gill, the former UKIP leader who has been jailed for 10.5 years, hugely long sentence for £40,000, but being bribed by the Russians to ask questions and speak on their behalf in the European Parliament. There are really big questions, I think, about the funding of Reform, the £9 billion or £9 million that's just come in from somebody who, you know, he's British, but he lives in Thailand and he carries both a British and a Thai passport. So there are huge questions about that. But I think the reality at a very basic level is that Reform is a one-man band, and as you mentioned earlier, you know, with the notable exception of Danny Kruger, who is a serious, thoughtful person. Whether or not you agree with him, he's got a brain. You've got, you know, the rabble of Nadine Dorries and Jonathan Gullis and Andrea Jenkins and people like that you've never even heard of. Meanwhile, what is happening in local authorities where Reform swept in on a huge swathe of votes in May, they're unravelling completely, you know, quicker than a bag of wool with a kitten in it. You know, we've got it in Kent, you can see it in Nottinghamshire, you can see it in Warwickshire. And I think that is the problem, because that is now coming home to roost. And so I think they're not necessarily storm clouds, but they're the grey clouds gathering that might, with a bit of media scrutiny, and this behaviour of I'm boycotting Prime Minister's questions because I don't get a question, so I'm going to sit in the press going, you're not entitled to a question. But interestingly, he was listed 6 for a question on the last day of Parliament, and it was a really important question. Oh, it's about farming, you know, which he's spoken out about. He wasn't even in the Commons. Yeah. So, you know, I think all of those things might begin to build into something a little less optimistic for Reform.
Jim, briefly, if you can, on reform.
Yeah, sure. Someone whose opinion I really respect has actually raised the rather intriguing question: would he actually want to be prime minister? I mean, we saw an example with Boris Johnson of a man who actually was not really temperamentally suited to being prime minister, with things coming across his desk every day. And when you actually examine the character of Nigel Farage, can you actually see him in number 10 dealing with a whole range of things which he wouldn't regard as important? And, you know, the tetchiness is beginning to show. So that's quite a fundamental issue if that sort of starts to gain traction. Because, you know, to some extent he is a one-man band. I mean, there are one or two people around him, Richard Tyson, the president of the party, who come over quite well. But, you know, this is really a Farage project. There are some impressors. A woman called Laura Cunningham, who appears on Newsnight quite a lot, who quite impresses me as well. So they've got that going for them. I mean, you know, I think they've probably peaked. But I still think they'll perform very well in the local elections, despite their coming up against reality when they're actually running local authorities.
Yeah, I think they'll probably do well in local elections, but I think people are still seeing it as a protest vote. And I absolutely take the point, Jim. In fact, I think I said it 4, 5, 6 weeks ago. Question marks as to whether Nigel Farage really wants to be Prime Minister. And I heard that from people in London who are Reform members. So, you know, he likes to be the boy who throws the bricks, doesn't he? Rather than the guy who's got to repair the problems that we've got in the country. So, yeah, and the other thing that is notable, and Joe, you sort of referenced this, is they've not managed to get any of those big name Tories across the line other than Kruger. I wonder whether he's wondering whether he's made the right decision as well at the moment. But, you know, Suella Braverman, she was supposed to go, hasn't gone. People were telling me my old mate Esther McVeigh might be a defector. She was certainly on watch, defection watch at one point, I think. She's not shown any signs of going anywhere. And so he's been left with this ragbag and bobtail of defectors, hasn't he? And, you know, Andrea Jenkins' performance at the Reform Conference, where she did karaoke to a song that she performed, which wouldn't have even graced the fucking Eurovision Song Contest. You know, that to me sort of summed up what they've managed to recruit. Nonetheless, it has been a good year for Reform. They continue to stay well ahead in the opinion polls, and as I said earlier, have often this year made the political weather. So I'm going to give them an 8.5 out of 10. Joe?
I'm going to give them 8 because they've changed the political weather, and they have changed the conversation, whether it's for the better or not. You know, I think the jury's probably fairly decided on that, but 8 out of 10 for impact.
Yeah.
Earlier in the year, I would have given 8, but I think there's some signs, as we've indicated, that perhaps the gloss is coming off it. So I'm going to give 7.
Okay, well, there you go. That you've had all our marks now for the domestic political parties. We've got much to discuss as far as international affairs are concerned for 2025. However, we have reached the anointed 60 minutes almost of today's podcast, and we are not going to go over time because off air, Jim berates me, despite the fact that it's often his fault we've gone over the 60 minutes. So what we're going to do is we're going to park international matters until a fortnight's time after Christmas when we come back, because we will then have Martin Littrott in situ as well, and we'll be able to get his expert views in terms of what has been happening in the United States, which of course is the place which often makes the political weather as far as geopolitics are concerned. So it just makes sense for us to park the discussion on international affairs until then. Right, well, it just leaves me to wish you all a very happy Christmas. Many thanks for your support over the last 12 months. We know that you would be disappointed if you weren't given your usual Monday fix of the Downtown Den Politics podcast. So we will be back in 7 days' time with a special edition where we'll be posing some questions that I've been asked out on my travels over the last few months. and also looking ahead to 2026 with our predictions and reminding people of what was predicted by the three wise monkeys 12 months ago. Only reminding you of that because my predictions were particularly accurate. So have a great Christmas, everyone. Thanks for listening. Thanks for all your continued support, and we will see you all next week.